What's up, everybody? I don't have the bell. I left the bell too.
Ding.
Ding. I gotta have the bell here. Hey guys, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for a special Monday live with Billy Tucci. But that Brofessionals opening is really cool. So I figured we play that. And I'm joined by a fellow bro right here, the great Graham Nolen. Thank you, Graham, for joining us. We got a great little show tonight.
I've been looking forward to this for a couple of weeks now.
I know. And hopefully we'll be joined by some of the other bros. But a few weeks ago, we had done a show about the, well, I guess I can just present it real quick. Let's do share screen. For those of you that may or may not know, Jack Kirby's infamous or famous 1990 interview with Gary over at Comics Journal. And it's, it's Jack's perspective on the whole thing of what happened, talking about who created what, who owns these characters, who deserves these characters. And for those of you that follow comics, you know about a lot of the controversy. And we kind of dissected it into it, right, Graham, with the Brofessionals. We got into it. We picked a piece. And then I got a delightful, well thought out, long email from the legendary Roy Thomas that he had caught our show. And he wanted to put his perspective on it because, as we all know, that he was there. Roy was there. And you're talking right in the midst of the Silver Age, of going forward. There are very few people in the world that has an insight and a perspective as our next guest. So I know, Graham, do you want to introduce our guest? Would you mind doing that?
Sure. We have a legend. We have Roy the Boy Thomas, the man who was handed the baton from Stan Lee himself to take over Marvel Comics when Stan decided he was gonna, pull back a little bit and eventually head out to Hollywood. So what more can you say? Here's Roy.
What more could anyone ask? So, ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only, Mr. Roy Thomas.
Well, thank you.
You got to have your applause from your audience.
I'm happy now and go home, and so forth.
Sir, it is so good to have you on. Everyone, I apologize for being late. It's my fault. My lighting broke. My big light that I got, part of the Blevins Media Center that lights up my entire background, just stopped working. It just stopped working. So I went and I ended up buying another light that I'm using here on Amazon. I got 1 day shipping, believe it or not. It came, but it doesn't plug. It plugs into it's a UBS plug, Graham Nolen.
Oh,
it's not a real plug. Come
on. Folks, I've seen Billy in good light. This is just fine. Believe me.
It's fine. Thank you, Roy, for joining us. If I can say something, though, too, if I can share my screen with something, is that for those of you that know that I like to hunt, or that I do, I've hunted almost every single day from October 1st till today, right? The one day I don't, because we're doing the show, we're fulfilling the Senryaku Omnibus Edition. Roy Thomas, this guy shows up onto my stand at 3:24 p.m., big old giant 6-pointer. This deer's got to be 7 years old. That's
a lot of venison.
A lot of venison,
there, buddy.
So Roy, thank you for coming on. If you want to explain why you and again, we are so honored that you're joining us. What kind of propelled you to reach out to us?
I watched it happen. I see some of the shows. This one happened to be on, I think, after the one of where John and Steve Houston do their podcast, and maybe it's the Stalin one. And yours was, my wife had recorded for me for a DVD to watch while I'm walking on the treadmill, And so I hear this thing is going to be about this interview, which I remember to a fair extent from reading it at the time and being outraged, by it then. So I hear you're going to talk about it. I thought, oh God, it's another round of Stan bashing. We've had plenty of those from the willfully ignorant over the last few years, especially since Stan passed away. Not that Stan didn't deserve any criticism and got plenty of it from me and other people, but the insanity of some of the people that are trying to bring him down to make Jack look good when Jack doesn't need anything to make him look good. offended me in that interview. And I was really pleased by the discussion. I mean, that I thought was an intelligent discussion that, trying to get to the facts and, without, just from what you remember from reading, and a lot of the stuff was right. There were minor things that were off, and I don't have all the answers. I've never claimed I was there when the most of these things were created. I came on board in early July of 1965, and as the Inhumans, the first Inhumans stories were going through the office and everything. That's I first like Gorgon and Karnak. They weren't out yet, and that was some of the first stuff. That was what I first saw, and Wally Wood had just quit, and they didn't have an artist for Daredevil, and it was sort of a weird, very busy time when I happened to come in there.
Yeah. What year was that, Roy?
This was July of 1965.
65. Okay.
And so I just decided I'd come in here and don't know if we get through it, but just add some perspective on the various aspects of that, including one of the digressions that was got into, which actually comes out of the interview, the idea of Jack and Spider-Man. I mean, I don't know everything about that, but and what was said on the show was pretty intelligent. I was just wanted to sort of add my own thoughts, not to outrage any of these other people. They don't need any help, but to give my own perspective. Someone doesn't want to either accept what I say, that's fine. If they want to disbelieve me or think I'm lying, if they're that crazy, well, then let them go. I just wanted to have my say. I appreciate Billy inviting me to do so.
No, it's a great honor because, as I said in the intro, you were there. So you were there. You witnessed so many of these creations. Like you said, the Inhumans was just a script or an idea at the time when you first joined in.
It was drawn already.
Oh,
it was going through an artwork farm, those stories. One of them might be a book that was printed except for the cover, what we call make-readies. It was, they sent us the guts, just the cover. The other one would be all written and lettered with this strange new inker, Joe Sinnott. It turned out had been the guy who had inked issue number 5, and I loved his inking right away. I thought the book looked immediately better, but I'd never seen this on the stands because I hadn't seen anything that from 2 or 3 minutes earlier, and so it was just fascinating something to be seeing it from a different perspective. And I was kind of catching up on what I'd missed, and having to look over things, and I was supposed to be writing on staff, but I couldn't do that because they kept giving me proofreading stuff to do instead. I much preferred that to sitting around trying to write on staff in a madhouse like what
I can't imagine that.
At the time, even with only a handful of people, it was still a madhouse with people in and out. I couldn't write in that environment, but but I was a witness. The thing I feel bad about is the fact that, having been a history major in college, taught a little history, always been interested in history and biography, especially history, more than any other academic subject. I feel like I really missed so many chances in those years to have got so much information. I mean, I picked up a lot, but because I was so busy with the job, with the excitement and the necessity of learning the job and then writing, and it was 40 hours a week in the office, plus any writing had to be extra. So I was working 50, 60 or more hours a week and in a whole new life, a new environment, that I didn't have the foresight and energy to be really keeping any records of, all the history I could have learned. Or I would ask certain questions, but it wasn't systematic. And I picked up a lot from Stan and from the other person, very important, is telling Saul Brodsky, who was the production manager, an artist in his own right. And he had been around ever since, at least, he'd been Stan's associate for years. And, he had designed the Fantastic Four logo for number 1. Artie Simek did the finished lettering, but he designed the logo. He inked issues number 3 and 4. So Saul had been on there too. And I learned, a lot from Saul. What I would always say about Saul is Saul would tell me anything that Stan might want me or not mind my knowing, and he would never tell me anything that Stan didn't want me to know. So if he said it, it might just about as well as been coming from Stan. And sometimes I got the same stories from both, and sometimes I can't remember because it was like the same person in those days, that first couple of years. But it was a good source of information. I'm only sorry that I didn't do it more systematically. Keep notes, but that's true with most of us, if we were.
Sure.
Well, that's the whole thing about history is you don't know you're going through it because you're too busy with your day-to-day things. It's only through reflection, looking back, when you realize, holy shit, I was there for this, that, and the other thing. Otherwise, it's day-to-day grind. You're pumping out comic books, on a periodical schedule.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you're working. And just real quick, I want to thank. We have a $2 super chat here from the great Nicholas Greer. Thank you, Nicholas Gear. Sorry, the legendary Roy Thomas. Thank you for that $2 super chat. And we've got a lot of great people here. I also want to thank. And Graham, thank you for joining us. Roy, thank you. Thank you, John Cimino, for actually setting this up. That we were able to get Mr. Thomas on with us. Thank you, John, and working in the shadows back there. But I want to say hi to everybody who continuously comes back. Marcus Killigrew, Randy Howell, Kevin Ryan, Fearsome Bullet. You guys are awesome, man. Schism, Jay Lee, great to see. Citizen Ronan, of course. Chris Thacker. You guys are awesome. We truly appreciate everyone watching us week after week, and especially for this really special show, because there's so much I want to know. And one of the things, again, that as Graham had said, it really came up that Jack came up very bitter about it, and you could see the reasons why. I mean, but you also wonder, did I was talking to Bo Smith, and Bo Smith was telling me about Stan, that Stan got all the credit, right? A lot of these creators later on, in hindsight, 2020, they were upset that they were never doing the interviews. It was always Stan trying to push the project. But Bo was telling me that Robert Kanigher, a couple of people would tell him, and other people that were working there when you were Roy at the time, that Stan would be begging these guys to talk to the press. Hey, we've got this college kid here who wants to interview for his newspaper. Can you do the interview? Oh, I'm just dropping my papers off. I got 30 pages I got to do in a month or whatever. I have to finish this issue in a month. I don't have time to sit and talk with this college kid. I don't have time to do that. And they would just come in and out pretty much, right? I mean, was it sort of like that with the artists and a lot of the other writers that were in this revolving door that
Yeah, I have to say, I can't honestly remember Stan certainly not coming to me, but then I was a new peon who had just been hired. But I can't remember Stan going to anybody at any time, and maybe John Romita later for some artistic thing, and asking them to talk to college students. Stan was quite happy to garner all that to himself. But it wasn't that, but they were kind of coming to him, and he had it is true. Of course, Jack only came in at that time maybe every Friday or every other Friday for a couple of hours to talk to Stan. Ditko was, while he was there those first few months, just in and out on an irregular basis to drop something off. Other artists the same way. Joe Sinnott, from the time he worked there, the first time I think after that he came into the office was 8 years later. I never met him for 8 years. And other people were in and out. They didn't, and for the most part, you're right. They weren't asked to, but they didn't really want to talk to the press. Martin Goodman too could have given a lot of interviews. He did almost no interviews. He had no interest. Stan had this feeling that the press would be good, and Stan was just, as far as I could tell, feeling his way along. He had stumbled into this thing, just by having to do a superhero comic, which he had. I don't think Stan had any more than, say, Julie Schwartz had at DC a few years earlier, had any special interest in doing superheroes again. They failed for Stan a couple of times. They failed at DC once or twice, so he didn't have any great interest in doing superheroes. He was just trying to keep the company, it had been if those giant monsters, had kept on selling, Stan would have been happy to keep doing Googum, Son of Goom for the rest of his life, I suppose, but they weren't selling. And suddenly, Stan, whatever the occasion, with or without some golf game, which Stan believed in, which may or may not have happened, that Goodman tells him, create a superhero group, not one superhero, but a whole group not because of Flash or Green Lantern, but because of Justice League, So the next day, so he starts off with a full-grown group, and except for the Human Torch, every character in it was, totally new. And and so he was just feeling his way along. He had no idea of creating a Marvel Age of Comics, a Marvel Universe, or even Marvel. He forgot later, but even calling it Marvel wasn't Stan's idea, though he later thought it was, because his memory was so bad. My wife Dan always said after meeting him once or twice that he was one of the most forward-looking people, as opposed to anybody looking back. Stan just, if it happened yesterday, Stan had no memory of it. He didn't even remember when I talked to him in 1965, that only a little more than 10 years earlier, they had revived the Human Torch, Captain America, and Submariner for a year. In the case of Submariner, 2 years. He didn't even remember it, and he had been the editor and probably wrote some of the stories, He had no memory. That was, and he didn't remember it. The company had been called, Atlas sort of for a while, but he had wanted to call the company. He told me one day early on that Martin Goodman wanted to call it more. He wanted to call the company Atlas when they started finally getting a name a couple of years in, because that had been the name of the distributor. But Goodman insisted on Marvel, and he said, he felt that Goodman made the right choice. Marvel's a better word, even than Atlas would have been okay, but Marvel was an even better word for them.
Sure.
Well, they could connect it to their first book too.
Yeah. Well, I told him that, but he didn't remember that either. I said, well, to me, it's always been Marvel, even though nothing's on it, because, you used to call for a year or so off and on back in the 40s, late 40s, when I was just reading the comics, right as those characters were dying. They had Marvel on the covers, not just the name of Marvel Mystery Comics, but it was called the Marvel Comic Group for, 2 different times about a year apart for a total of a year or two. Again, Stan had no memory that had ever happened, even though he was the editor at the time and may have helped make the decision, or at least acquiesced in it and had to oversee all those covers. He just never thought about the past. He was busy thinking about the present and the future, and the past was. That's why when he started telling stories, he gets so much stuff wrong, because he did. And once he'd get a story that he kind of liked, he would convince himself it was true. And sometimes I can tell it was kind of true. Sometimes it was half true. Sometimes, there wasn't much truth in it. But, after you tell a story often enough, you sort of believe it must have actually happened. And some things I couldn't begin to separate, and some things I could sort of figure out what it was. But, it's digging. It's more, sometimes it's as much like archaeology as it is like history.
Yes. But he told the stories with panache.
He believed it.
I think Stan was a frustrated actor. And he that comes across in his personality, his desires for the media, and his ability to navigate the media so well with that personality of his. Have you ever seen that? It's on YouTube. It was a failed talk show that Stan tried to get off the ground, where he interviewed these college kids. It was really, it's black and white. It's got to be from maybe 67, maybe 68. And he's got these 2 radicals on there from NYU, I believe. One is the publisher of the newspaper, and the other guy was some type of reactionary or something like that. And, Stan is talking to these guys, and he talks just like his characters did when they dealt with hippies and stuff in the comics. Stan, very open-minded, but he also, he in his interview, he understands where these kids are coming from, but by the same token, he's also pushing organization and the rule of law and the rule of society, where these guys want to just burn it all down, Yeah.
Have things changed, huh, with college kids?
Yeah.
I don't think Stan, was really a very political person. I mean, I don't really know much about his political beliefs or anything like that. I mean, he wasn't especially knowledgeable on these things. I remember early on, this would have been around the turn of 65, 66, when Denny O'Neil was on staff for a few months. We were sitting there, and Stan started talking about a story he'd like to do in some book. I don't know if it was Iron Man or whatever. He was just talking to Denny and me, and he said, the Red Skull has kidnapped the Red Chinese ambassador to the United Nations. And we had to explain to him that Red Chinese did not have an ambassador to the United Nations at the time. Taiwan was officially China. Stan went, oh, really? He's living in New York, all his life, just a stone's throw away from the United Nations. And believe me, a lot of us wanted to throw stones at the United Nations. Right. And, but he just really didn't follow politics very much at all. And the problem is he liked to walk this tightrope, it was sort of truth, justice, American way, his own version of it. He wanted to have a kind of a liberal view, and we all did in a certain sense that way. And at the same time, he was conservative in other ways. He kind of wanted to walk in the middle of the road. And the problem is that by the late 60s, it became almost impossible to walk the middle of the road, because both sides wanted to pull you over to their side. The radicals weren't happy that, that Stan wasn't against the Vietnam War. The other people wanted an even stronger defense, and so forth. And so Stan was kind of trying to pull back. You remember there had been the communist villains in the early Marvel comics? That all kind of vanished after a few years. He had a few stories set in Vietnam, and they all went. The bigger the war became, the more Stan pulled back until finally you wouldn't have thought there was a Vietnam on the map, even.
I love that early Hulk story where the Hulk says, "I'm going to send you back to vodka land." to the Russian
That's a Stan's political theory, I think. Yeah,
that was a riot.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we have another guest on the show, another fellow professional, the first man of comics, ladies and gentlemen, Andy Smith. What's up, buddy?
Hello. Hello.
Hey, Roy.
Hi.
It's been a while. You probably don't remember. It's been, maybe a decade or so, but I actually sat next to you at a convention in South Carolina.
I go to a lot of them. Or not South Carolina, or was it Charlotte and North Carolina, maybe? Right over the border.
No, I live in Charlotte.
They've been in Columbia.
I don't know. It might have been.
Yeah. I don't think either one of us remembers too much, huh?
Yeah, no. I just remember sitting next to you and we had a nice conversation and stuff. Right. So,
well, I'm glad I didn't embarrass myself.
That's what those guys do.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's time yet, Roy.
Yeah, there's time. So, Roy, there's a couple of things that we're addressing, and Jack had mentioned twice in the 1990 interview. And again, no one here is bashing Jack Kirby. We adore Jack Kirby. He's a hero to each and every one of us. But one of his comments, and he had mentioned it twice, was seeing Stan crying in the office that they were moving the furniture out. And I know that's before your time. I don't know if that's 63 or 61. Well, 61, right? I think it would be.
That's one of the questions. Nobody quite knows when it would have been. If he was talking about the Fantastic Four, it would have been the turn of 60-61 to get the book out by the summer of 61. Yeah. But by that time, Jack had already been back and working steadily at Marvel for a couple of years, doing all the fin fan foom kind of stories. Mm-hmm. So it was too late for him to come in and say he was going to save Marvel. He'd been there 2 years doing those comics, and they weren't particularly selling. I mean, they were hanging on by their teeth. Mm-hmm. If he's talking about 1958-59, about the time he did come back on a regular basis after he was kicked out at DC in what was the luckiest thing that ever happened to Stan and Marvel and maybe the comics industry.
Yeah, and that was Jack Schiff. Just real quick, do you recall, does anyone know why he was banned from DC by the editor?
Yeah, obviously I wasn't the first-hand witness, but I've kind of studied that. Basically, Jack was doing that strip, Sky Masters, which Jack Schiff had arranged. He didn't write it, but he sort of put it together, a producer. It was outside of DC. Of course, Jack Schiff was a major DC editor at that time, a big power there, but this was an outside project, and he hired Jack Kirby, who was, freelancer, bouncing around, doing probably Challengers at the time or whatever. He hired him to be the penciler. They had Wally Wood, later Dick Ayers, inking it. Well, Jack evidently was supposed to take care of all the finances. And I don't remember all the details, but basically I think he had to pay the letter and everything else. But anyway, they got in a dispute about how, Jack didn't feel he was getting enough of the money because he was having to pay all these people. Schiff didn't feel he was getting enough of the money. And there was a lawsuit. Now, I suspect probably it was Schiff sued Jack, but maybe there were, it might have been back and forth too. All I know is that at the end, evidently Jack Schiff won the lawsuit. Kirby had to pay these things, and the strip kind of folded and went away anyway because it was just barely hanging. It was never a really popular strip, beautiful as it was. And but there was one major fallout. Although this had absolutely nothing to do with DC Comics, where Jack was drawing Challengers of the Unknown, Jack Schiff was a vengeful guy. Evidently, if I ever met him, it was only in passing. But he didn't just think of this as a dispute outside the comics. He then used his power as a major editor at DC to basically get Jack Kirby banned from DC. I mean, it's a very small-minded move. And, next thing you know, how many companies are there in the field? There's Archie, there's Harvey. They're not doing much in the kind of field Jack has. So he has to go back crawling to Marvel, which wasn't Marvel then yet, to Stan Lee, for whom he really hadn't worked except maybe one or two stories for years. He'd never worked for Stan except maybe one or two stories a year or two before.
Yeah.
And it's and of course they pay much lower rates, so he's having to turn out work at a much faster rate. It isn't the level of quality of the challenges of the unknown, and it was the luckiest thing ever happened to Stan. Whether this was right after, now if it was in '58, that it could have been. Some people think that it was after that the crying was because of maybe Joe Manili having the company was going through bad times in '58 or so after the collapse of the distributor and everything else. And, so maybe he was also upset about that. Maybe they were moving some furniture out because, the company was obviously hanging by a thread. It's hard. But of course, as several of the artists on that other show pointed out, Jack the story doesn't make much sense. I certainly would never accuse Jack of lying. I think his memories were just all mixed up, and he was very bitter, and he was really lashing out and saying things that much more extreme than he ever said, and much less sensical than a very nice guy like Jack usually said, by saying, that he came in and he's saving the company like Mighty Mouse or something like that, But the funny thing is, it was so lucky. I think Mark Avadere recorded in his book on Kirby the best story I ever heard. Supposedly Mike Sikowski, the Justice League artist, was one day sitting there and somebody asked Sikowski, according to Mark, said that, listen, whoever won that lawsuit between Jack Kirby and Jack Schiff? And Sikowski looks up and says, Stan Lee.
Yeah.
That's about as true as it gets, whatever else happened, And Stan had always, liked Kirby's work, so much, obviously. I mean, he, first of all, when he came to work there, the only two guys sort of on staff were Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. One thing that was a little confused on the other show, there was a question about were Joe and Jack freelancers when Captain America was created in 1940 near the being. And the thing is, no, Joe was hired earlier that year by Martin Goodman to be the editor of the comics department. He was hired away from, he was working at Lloyd J.K.'s Funnies Incorporated and this and that. And he was hired over because Goodman saw some of his artwork and hired him. And he ended up asking him to do the fiery masks so that it would be another fire character to scare off people that were going to imitate the Human Torch, things like this. And all that happened is Goodman hires Simon, and Simon has this guy that works with him, his partner that used to do Blue Bolt with him, this guy named Jack Kirby. And he says, I'll come, but only if I can bring my partner with me. And that is how Jack Kirby first came to Marvel, as an add-on to Joe Simon. I guess he had a staff job. Maybe he was not officially staffed, but he was there every day. He was working on everything. So but they had an agreement. Now, how much of it was in writing or not, I do not know. But they had an agreement. I suspect there was some writing with Goodman about sharing in the profits of Captain America. Even though Goodman may have suggested I'd like a patriotic character, facts were made. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby came up with it. And then evidently Joe and Jack were tipped off by one of the accountants that worked for Goodman, pulled him aside and said, listen, Martin Goodman is it's an old Hollywood trick. He's charging everything, every loss or every expense of any of the other comics, he's charging them all to Captain America so that there's about 3 cents left to divide between when it comes time for profit sharing.
Right.
So vertical integration, that's called.
You've heard, yes, you've heard of that, right?
Yeah.
Right. Hollywood famous for that, right?
Yeah.
Well, Goodman was ahead of his time there, and he was doing that evidently, and so Joe and Jack, they can play at tricks too, and they go over to DC, so they make arrangements to leave, and that's when they ended up doing Sandman and Boy Commandos and all that stuff, and they left after the first 10 issues of Captain America, and there was. Except, I think there was another relative who helped out with the comics a little, but he wasn't an artist, writer, editor, or anything really. So there's just this one guy on staff who'd been hired a few months earlier to help out, a guy named Stanley Lieber, writing under the name Stan Lee. So according to Stan, who told me this like in the first few weeks I worked for him, he said that Martin just asked me, can you handle the comics for a few weeks till I find a regular editor? And of course, that had been by that time, that was already about 25 years early. He says, you never got back to me, so I guess he's still looking,
Yeah.
The thing is, they were not freelancers. That's why there's a different deal. And that's why the interesting thing is, when Joe Simon sued in the late 60s, 66, 67 to try to get Captain America back, Carl Burgess did it around the same time with the torch. Guess who testified on Marvel's side against Joe Simon and in favor of Marvel owning Captain America?
Jack?
A freelance semi-staff artist named Jack Kirby, which of course didn't help anything either. So these things get very tangled. At that time, Jack was on Marvel's side. Another time, if he had, but he was just doing it to keep his job, not because of what he believed or didn't believe.
Right.
That's sad. That's
crazy,
sad.
confused
It
world.
is, because you'd think he would have been on Simon's side, because if Simon got it back, they created it together, didn't Cap together back in the 40s, right?
Yes, but Jack Jack liked to pretend, and I get this from people like Gil Kane, who knew him much better than I did, that he liked to put himself out as being confrontational. Maybe he got in a lot of fights on the streets of Brooklyn when he was a kid, and that led to Boy Commandos. I don't know. But Jack was really not confrontational at all. If he, as Gil would say, he would come in, talk to Stan. Stan would say, here, Jack, change this page. And they didn't have any facilities for even paying him extra. So Jack would just have to make this change. Maybe he agreed with it. Probably he didn't. Maybe it was a good idea. Maybe it wasn't. And then Gil and he would go out to lunch, and he would sit there for an hour or two raging about Stan Lee. But would he ever say a word to Stan, even complain to him? Practically never. Finally, he got up the nerve to finally say he wanted a little more credit, on the stories, because he didn't like the idea that Stan was saying writer and he was artist. But did he want credit as co-plotter? Did he want credit, what he wanted? No, he said, let's just put it, he thought back to the old Simon and Kirby days, I guess. And he said, and he suggested evidently, a Stan Lee and Jack Kirby co-production, which simply kept it more confused, because when you put that in, you have no idea who did what, and you leave it open either for Jack to claim he did everything, or for Stan to claim he did everything, and for other people who know a lot less than even I do to claim that this guy or that guy, did everything. And of course, the actual fact is, you don't really know, because I'm sure that in some stories, more so at the beginning, Stan was a heavier hand with plotting, and not just because that Fantastic Four plot was genuine and not at all a fraud, like some people want you to believe. But also because, Jack was just looking to keep his job. And, so if Stan gave him a vague idea, Jack would just do it. But, Stan gave Jack a lot of credit in those comics. And we all know this, You would talk about how he just barely gave Jack the germ of an idea, or he even said once, even Jack may just come up with a whole idea for himself. Well, of course, if Stan had thought about it, he wouldn't have said that, maybe because it left him vulnerable. But back in the 60s, he wasn't thinking about future lawsuits or bitterness. He's just thinking about filling a bullpen bulletin.
Yes.
Well, what's interesting too is what one considers to be the creation of something. Stan, in the Searching for Steve Ditko documentary, was interviewed, and the English guy got him to actually say that he believes, this is Stan, I believe that the man who comes up with the idea is the creator. And
that's what he
and that was revelatory, that the real Stan Lee came out and said that. And then he says, I wish I hadn't said that. I wish he didn't make me say that. And then he had to backtrack a little bit and go into what he meant by that. And then they also discussed the whole letter that he wrote considering Steve Ditko the co-creator of Spider-Man. And
you guys were right on that, though, because the people who were saying that this was the real Stan kind of creeping through, the thing that wasn't genuine, I think, he tried, but the thing that wasn't really genuine was the letter. Stan wrote that I have always, which is not true, I don't think. I mean, I didn't hear him say a lot, but I don't think Stan really considered Steve the co-creator of Spider-Man. I do, but I don't think Stan did. The thing I remember the most is a luncheon that he and I had in the 80s when I wasn't working for him, so I'd say anything I wanted to, And we'd have lunch at once or twice a year or something, and we had this lunch at this place Stan took me to, because there were no people there because the food wasn't very good. He said so he could always get a table. That's what he told me. Anyway, and he started talking about some of the controversy with Steve was coming to the fore at that time in the middle 80s, whatever it was, and he says. He says, well, he gave exactly the line you were just saying about, I just consider the person who came up with the original idea to be the creator, the other people, they develop it and this and that, but the creator. And I said, well, I just can't see, you can't see Steve as the co-creator. He obviously designed the costume, most of it, if not all of it. You plotted the stories together, forgetting about later stories, just if you just count the origin, Steve had to be involved because you didn't write a script in advance. Even though no matter how closely it was plotted, Steve was contributing to that. That's the least it could be, forgetting about anything more.
And the visual language that was used, the visual language of the characters. He
gave me a strange example. He mentioned, what was the guy who did Mr. T, A-Team, and all those shows?
Stephen Cannell.
Yeah, and remember he had the logo that was the picture of him typing, and then the paper flies out of the typewriter and comes up and says a Steve Cannell. And he says, well, when you have a Steve Cannell show, he said. Says, it doesn't say that this guy wrote it and this guy did this. That it says that later on, but it says, it's created by Steve Cannell, and everything. And I said very simply what I believed. I said, yes, I said, Stan, that is absolutely true. However, that is not a function of creativity. That's a function of power.
Yeah.
Steve Cannell is the producer. You want to play in his ballpark, you say he created it. Even if you brought the idea to him, it becomes a Steve Cannell idea, and you take your paycheck and accept the fiction, just like we do with, work for hire, the fiction that Marvel Comics wrote or drew something. We all know DC Comics and Marvel Comics don't write or draw anything. It's a legal fiction. Right. And we just accept it because we want to keep on getting the paychecks, and we enjoy our jobs, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah. I want to just cover it. We have a couple of super chats real quick. And thank you so much, Aaron Sleeper, $5 for that wonderful super chat. Thank you so much. I feel most other artists, creators I've known, definitely how I am, like talking to people, but aren't necessarily the super outgoing types. He's referring to when Bo had told me that I forget who had told him that Stan wanted to have these, please talk to this college kid, talk to this interview, and the artist didn't. And then Roy cleared that up and said, no, Stan was perfectly happy talking to everybody.
He may have done that.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Right. And then we have another one. Thank you so much, Neon Knight Rider. It's always great to see you. In the book by Sean Howe, it says a very young Stan snitched on Jack and Joe for working with other publishers and were fired for it. Are you familiar with that? I haven't read the book.
Yes, it's an excellent book. It has some, like all books, including the ones I work on, it has some errors in. But Sean Howe's book is such an excellent book. Marvel won't deal with him anymore. That's wrong with it. I guess they got mad about that he revealed they didn't want revealed. But it's really basically a good book. Yeah, any one individual fact you may take with a grain of salt, like you do in any book. But the overall feels very good. No, what happened is that. Stan was accused of doing that. What happened is Stan, as the young kid, trailed along after Jack and Joe evidently one day. Joe tells this story several different times, at least. I think Jack's told variations of it one time. I never heard it from Stan. But Jack just kind of trailed around with him while they were moonlighting. They were already starting, I guess, to work for DC. Remember, they also did the first Captain Marvel comic book?
Yeah.
Moonlighted and did that with Dick Reefer helping him out. That was moonlighting while they were actually officially, Joe and probably Jack were on staff at Marvel. And Joe's theory, which I don't know, doesn't sound right to me, was that what they did outside the office, even if they were on staff, was none of Martin Goodman's business. I'm not sure that's exactly the terms of their employment, but that was his theory. Mm-hmm. And evidently Stan kind of hung around, kind of trailing around after him. So they told him their secret, that they were working for whether DC or Captain Marvel, whatever it was, probably the DC thing by that stage. And then after that, Martin Goodman learned about it, and suddenly 3 or 4 of his many brothers, surround Joe and Jack, and so forth about it. But the thing is, Stan always denied he did it. And Joe, in one of his books, or it's the same book he wrote over and over again, but he kept saying this, that he didn't necessarily, he said he had to think in retrospect, they'd been over to DC a time or two, right? They'd been around there a couple of times ago. They were dealing with editors, dealing with maybe other artists that we'd be working with them, writers, publisher, whatever. There were a lot of people that knew that secret. And the fact that Stan Lee knew it was sworn to secrecy doesn't prove that he did it any more than about 5, 10, 15, 20 other people could have done it. Now, Joe had the story that Jack hated Stan, for the rest of his life for this. I never, heard that from any other source except Joe. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But even if he did, that doesn't prove that Stan did it. Stan always denied it. And Stan's no more than one of 10 or 20 or 30 usual suspects in that case. There is absolutely no proof, anything more than the story itself that was Stan who did it. Stan may have snitched on him and may not have snitched on him.
You had mentioned the famous Fantastic Four synopsis.
Mm-hmm.
It's a half-page synopsis. Can you get a little bit into that? Because still trying to figure out, and then I'd like to know, who do you think? Let's just hit with Fantastic Four. Who do you think should be credited with creating the Fantastic Four? Apparently, to the article that the Comics Journal article from 1990, Jack basically said he created them. It was all him.
Mm-hmm.
What do you feel? And explain that for those who aren't familiar with the synopsis.
Yeah. Well, the synopsis, I don't remember when I first saw it. It would have been in the latter 60, not before 66 or so, or 67, somewhere in there. Stan knew that even if I wasn't very organized about it, he knew that I was interested in the history. I was, the only person who was. None of the other artists coming around. There weren't fans coming around asking about the history. They might want to know what was going to happen in the Hulk next week or in this or that, but they weren't asking questions about the history of, who created this or who did that. I did stuff like that. In a very unorganized, haphazard way. So Stan knew I was interested. So one day he drags out this carbon of a 2-page thing done on an old typewriter ribbon with crossouts and everything else. That was a synopsis for what was supposed to be about the first half of Fantastic Four #1. And he said, I found this. Now some people have said, Jack forged, that he was forged later. Well, of course, that's ludicrous because in 1966, 67, 60, anytime like this, Jack was still working for the company. He didn't even move. He didn't quit till 70. There was no dispute in public or anywhere else about who did the Fantastic Four or did this and that. So Stan just handed, and Jack's name is mentioned in it, so he's not cutting him out of it. And Stan off and on vacillated, but most of the time, he really wasn't quite sure if they might have talked some of it over before. What it really looks like to me is they talked that however the idea came up, they talked something over. Stan wrote out this synopsis. What I think happened is that Jack probably went home from the talk and maybe jumped the gun. Instead of waiting for the synopsis, if he had maybe a dead day or two because he was so fast, he starts drawing anyway without waiting for the synopsis. So that you notice what happens is it doesn't start the way the synopsis does, which is a linear version of the origin of the Fantastic Four. These 4 people, they go into space and they get the powers and the whole thing, which was supposed to be the story. Jack starts out with the Fantastic Four being gathered by a signal in the sky, and here's a scene for a page of the Invisible Girl, and we see her powers. We see the Thing's powers, we see the Human Torch's powers, and then Mr. Fantastic's powers. And it takes them about 7-8 pages to get together. And my feeling is about this time, whether it's the plot arriving, which Jack says he never saw, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have just forgotten it or only glanced at it, or remembered what he and Stan had discussed in the first place. And he crowds that whole thing that should have been 10 or 11 pages into about 4 or 5 pages, and I actually think that worked out better. The whole story's kind of crowded. It gets them up into space. They crash. They suddenly discover they got powers, and in the meantime, we've really seen good uses of their powers in the first 7 or 8 pages. And I don't think Jack, was lying when he said that he never saw it. I think he just didn't remember seeing it. Or maybe he didn't pay much attention to it, but he's following it. If Stan had wanted to forge something or whatever you call that, fake something later to prove prior creation, he would not have put in the stuff he did.
Right.
He has that they're going to go to Mars, which is not true. He calls Sue a model/actress or whatever equivalent. Yeah. He was never either one of those things. He says that Johnny Storm is a high school athlete, which Johnny Storm was not. It has several other different little things like that. All this stuff. If you're gonna try to prove that you invented the idea, you don't put in a lot of stuff that isn't in the story that got thrown away. You'd make it exactly like it to show how prescient you were. You wouldn't make yourself look that bad. But the people who are trying to prove Jack's primacy and everything, not leave it open to debate. They just ignore any kind of logic. It's like the fact that it doesn't make sense, which is what some of you artists were saying, that some of the things in that interview just don't make any logical sense. It's just care because their idea is Jack was the creator. Now, as far as your question about who created it, I wasn't there, so I don't know. The official story, which I heard later, but I wasn't there, was, obviously, I think it's almost on debate that if there's one guy who created the Fantastic Four in a certain sense, it would be Martin Goodman by Stan's theory, wouldn't it? Martin Goodman says, "I want a team."
I had the idea.
Right.
You could say that the creator was Martin Goodman because he probably intended for Stan to bring back Captain America, Human Torch, and Submariner. Stan later said, I didn't hear it in the early days, but later Stan said that he had told him, he could just bring those guys back. But he made up a new group and he kept up a new version of the Torch. He thought he might make a good member, but he probably thought, the Submariner, my God, I'd have to have him in the water all the time, And Captain America, this wasn't the heaviest time for patriotic heroes, but he thought the Human Torch might have possibilities, I guess. So he kept him in, and they've been doing all these monster stories, so he does a monster. Now, sure, Jack contributed an enormous amount to that stuff. Maybe Jack brought the idea in. I don't believe it. But he could have. I'm never going to know. You're never going to know. And the willfully ignorant out there in fan land and at their little PCs, they're not going to know either.
Sure.
There's an interesting radio interview, and it was on Jack's birthday at a New York City, and it was much later. I think it was after Jack had left for DC, and Jack was kind of like in the article with not as much venom, but he was going on about, his time at Marvel and stuff like that. And then Stan calls into the radio station, and he calls and he, effervescent and wishes Jack a happy birthday and everything. And then Jack says something about how he wrote the stuff because, he was writing all the dialogue on the sidebars and stuff like that. And it's like Roy said, like, he was not very aggressive. He was aggressive when Stan wasn't on, but when Stan called in, he kind of backed down. And Stan said, when Jack made the claim that he was writing the dialogue himself, Stan says, Jack, you've never read any of our comics, have you? Because none of that dialogue that you wrote is in any of the comics. Most of the stuff that Jack wrote, when you look at the artwork, is panel description. Not narrative, not dialogue that's enhancing the characters or anything. It's more like, the Thing punches this guy and he goes flying through the wall, when in fact in the drawing it's the Thing punching a guy and he's going through a wall.
Well, Jack did put some of it. You'll find some either direct or indirect dialogue in there. But the thing is, and of course the names and some of the things came, from Jack. But again, how do we know whether Stan mentioned the name first? There's no way to really know this. Jack did a lot of it, but it's difficult to know. But I know for a fact from, when I came there in 1965 and then various conversations from the beginning and after with Stan, that he didn't like Jack's dialogue or the description even for captions. Jack was his idea of like the perfect superhero artist always, and he always hated the fact that there was the disagreement between them. I'm not saying he was totally innocent of ever causing any of the problems, accidentally, but he hated it, and he would never have done it on purpose. But I think Jack stood up for himself more on that interview that was on a show called Hour 25 in LA by Mike Hotel. I was on the show once myself, and he was. He stood up for himself more because he says, well, I wrote that. And then he says, I wasn't allowed to write, the stuff. And Jack's, but Stan had told me a million times years earlier, said that he felt that he didn't think Jack ever read the stories. And that's why, once he had written them, he just assumed that Stan took his dialogue or his suggestions of this and that and turned it into dialogue. And Stan did a little of that, but Stan deliberately, and he told me this, and I know it's true, he deliberately avoided it because he didn't like Jack's way of phrasing things and so forth. And secondly, he felt that he wanted it to be his, because he felt he knew how to sell those comics with a dialogue. He didn't think Jack did. He felt Jack was the perfect storyteller of superheroes. He felt he was the perfect artist. There was nobody better. Nobody as good. but that he didn't like his writing, and he was the guy. I remember Stan's the guy in charge. If books don't sell, Martin Goodman, even though Stan seemed to act like he had this great personal relationship with Martin Goodman, but Stan was going to be the guy called into the office by Martin Goodman saying, why the hell isn't this book better or doing this? He'd say, well, Jack Kirby wanted it to be this way. That wasn't going to fly with the publisher. And Stan knew that. It was his responsibility, so he had to do things the way he thought them. He was in charge, and while Stan was a great admirer of talent, he actually liked comic art. I think a lot of the DC editors didn't give a damn about any of it, but Stan actually liked comic art, and he liked Kirby and some of the various other people at Ditko. He loved their work, and but he was the boss, and he was going to do what he thought was best. If that meant writing roughshod over. So sometimes he wasn't as diplomatic as he could have been. Instead of trying to wheedle him in, he'd just say, "Here, Jack, I want this to be changed." Well, that could hurt a guy's feelings. And Jack came out and tore one page in half once when he came out of the office, and Larry Lieber grabbed it up and taped it back together. Things like that. But Stan for a guy who was the editor, he made a lot of mistakes as an editor. We all did, and I think a lot of those, rubbed people the wrong. He didn't know, but he's whatever Jack said. Stan had more of an artistic. He was not just an office boy kind of guy. He wasn't like a major writer before that period, but he had a lot more talent, skill, editorially, and writing than Stan. And you think of all the credit, even if it isn't enough, that Stan has given Jack Kirby over the years, and other artists too, but especially Jack. How much credit has Jack Kirby ever given Stan for anything?
Oh,
I can't think of anything. If it isn't a complaint, it's something neutral, like, well, Stan Lee was my editor. I remember we said it was the most he was.
Roy, I have a question for you. We mentioned the Jack Schiff thing, and how Jack was a kind of a mean-spirited person by blackballing because he had that disagreement with Jack Kirby. Now, when Jack went to DC, and he sort of slagged you and Stan with his characters, House Roy and what was the Stan character? Funky Flashman. Right. And yet when Carmine decided to let him go and he came back to Marvel, you guys did not harbor those type of feelings that Jack Schiff had. I mean, you saw his talent and you said, okay, you can come back to Marvel. What was your feeling about that? How did you and Stan feel about that? It's sort of a big thing, I think.
I'm going to tell you two fast stories that'll tell the whole thing because they're the two ways it happened. 1974, San Diego convention. I was flown out at the last minute to be a major guest. I'm there. Stan and his son Neil and maybe Roz was there. I can't recall, but asked if Neil, I guess, asked if I'd have a drink with her. I was still the editor in chief. As it turned out, I would quit in a couple of weeks, but I was still the editor in chief. Although that's like being Stan Lee's foreman, shop foreman, more than being a real editor in chief at that time. At that time, because he was still very much there and so forth. But that was fine with me. So he starts feeling me out. This is 1974. He's starting to feel me out about. What do you think, Stan? He sort of bypassed me. He's not asked would I be interested because he knows the mean guy is Stan. It's not anybody else. Stan's the publisher by this point. And it's not me. It's nobody else. Goodman's gone. He says, how do you think Stan would feel about if I wanted to come back to Marvel? And I got a little playful, I guess, because I said, truthfully, I said, look, I said, he never wanted you to leave. Jack, the way Stan heard that Jack had quit was Jack called him up one day in 1970 and said, by the way, I've quit and I'm working for DC. He called him up after the fact, which, hurt Stan a lot. Stan hadn't known he was about to quit. I mean, he knew there were some problems, but he was a little too obtuse to see how deep they were. The rest of them I thought more than he did. So I got a little playful. I said, there's just one little thing kind of in the way. It really wasn't particularly, but I wanted to get it off my chest. That, there was that thing with Funky Flashman a year or two back. And I said, no, I didn't care House Roy. It's kind of a cute name in a way. And I was just collateral damage, I guess, in a way.
Right.
So I didn't take it personally because I didn't think Jack was really after me. In fact, I came almost sympathetically in that story. But I said, Stan was really hurt. Actually, he was livid as well as hurt. But I thought Stan was really hurt by the Funky Flashman, surprised to see that and hurt. Mm-hmm. I said, that's a little bit of a problem, And Jack just kind of gives this nervous laugh, says, well, that's all in fun. And at that point I had to quit, because if everybody at that table, including Jack and myself, knew that it was not in fun. But I'm not going to call Jack Kirby a liar in that case. If he wasn't lying, he had deluded himself. But I said, okay, fine. I said, look, there's not going to be any problem. Little for me, I said, Jack, Stan would love it. So forth. No problem at all. Just like it never happened. Well, you're never going to really forget that. It's never going to quite be the same between Stan and Jack as it was before. But at the same time, Stan wanted him back. So, but nothing happens. He delayed another few months or so, and sometimes 6 months or so later, I'm not the editor-in-chief anymore, but I'd come into office a day or two a week to check on things and drop off stuff. And Stan calls me into his office. He says, come here. He says, what? He says, it finally happened. Jack's leaving DC, and he called me, and he wants to come back. I said, well, that's great. He says, what do you think of? He says, what do you think of? I says, well, get him back, but don't let him write, because we both agreed that Jack's writing was not right. I felt on my own totally the same. I didn't like the writing of the Fourth World, whatever virtues it had. So he says, Stan says, Jack says if he comes back, he's got to write his own material. So I thought, I said, okay, well, then get him back anyway. It's better to have him at Marvel than have him at DC. If you got to have him write, what the hell, he'll probably be all right. Just a couple of books, and, he'll be drawing it, et cetera. And he said, well, that's what I think too. He says, he didn't tell me who, but he says, there's a couple of people out there. And that means it had to be somebody at a high level. We're not talking some low production guy he wouldn't have paid attention to. There's a couple of people out there in editoring, major production people, I don't know who really don't think I should let Jack come back. And when they heard vaguely about this, he says, they just didn't think Jack should be allowed to come back. And I said, look, they're idiots. I said, that's a direct quote. I said, they're idiots. Ignore them. Get him back. He said, well, that's what I thought too, but I wanted to see, because Stan and I, despite our differences that had led me to leave, we had a certain rapport, and he respected he would have done this with or without me. I wasn't influencing the decision, but he felt good to have somebody whose opinion he respected agree when he had a couple of people, and I don't know, was it Ramit? I can't believe it was. Was it one of the editors, whoever it was then? Who was it? But in some ways, I didn't want to know, because I would have lost so much respect for the person who said that Jack Kirby shouldn't come back to Marvel. It would probably have affected my relationship with them at least my opinion of them for the rest of my life, because whatever faults Jack had, Stan had, they had done wonderful work together. He had co-created so many of these characters, and Jack should be back at Marvel. It's just a shame it didn't, work out in the long haul, but they tried, and Stan and Jack were appearing together and looking like buddies. Then, of course, as soon as it all fell apart, suddenly Jack is trashing Stan again and so forth. And I think at this stage, Stan finally just gave up.
Sure. Oh, that's interesting. So, Kirby came back in 76. Like, his work started appearing in 76, right?
Yeah. He came back, a few months before, but it was been 75, 76 when he actually started.
Right. Mm-hmm. I remember when he came back, and, there's the big ads and stuff, and I was all excited. Yeah, Kirby's going to be back. But by that time, the artwork wasn't the same as it was when he left. It wasn't even the same as it was when he had started the Fourth World. And then his writing, it's like it was always detached from the Marvel universe. So, I never believed that Captain America, that his Captain America existed in the same world. And I just didn't care for it. When he created his own stuff, like the Eternals, things like that, and at DC, I kind of liked some of his stuff, the writing there. It's clunky and it's dated. Like the way the characters speak was very, very dated. But he's a blunt instrument. There was no nuance like there was with Stan when you read his work. But that in itself, sometimes, depending on what the project is, could be a really cool and exciting thing. If it's a really bombastic type of story, Jack's stuff worked really well. But when it came back to Marvel, there wasn't really anything that really lit me up, I didn't think.
Well, Jack was determined not to be integrated back into the Marvel universe, which is what you're hitting at. You could sense. Right. You'll notice, he never, unless he did a whole character like what he got, like with Captain America or the Black Panther, but none of the other characters appeared in those stories. He dropped the Black Panther. Now, the Black Panther hadn't been selling well, that well before with the stuff that is now the basis of the movies and stuff, and so forth. But it had its following, right? And it had some human stuff. And Jack should have obviously continued that and then gone off in his own direction. Instead, he just ignored everything that had been happening for the last couple of years, starting off anew, thereby probably alienated some of the readers who would have followed him into the Black thing. Mm-hmm. Captain America had almost no connection with the stuff that Steve Englehart and others had been doing. When he was pushed to have the Hulk in one of the stories, he makes it a Hulk robot instead of the real Hulk.
Yeah.
It was sort of like when Ditko later would refuse to draw a Spider-Man or Doctor Strange. I think Jack had this viewpoint at that point that he felt like he was the thoroughbred racehorse who'd been ridden by a lot of inferior jockeys, and he wasn't going to ride any more of them across the finish line. He was going to buck them off and go by himself. And I think that was the problem. Yeah.
Well, with that too, and if I remember correctly, Jack didn't really read any of the comics. Mm-hmm. So do you think it's also because he's like, well, if I integrate Cap with all the other Marvel Universe stuff or continue the Black Panther stuff, that means I've got to go read all that previous stuff. And he might have just been like, I don't want to read all that. I can just do my own thing.
It could have been some of that. I think it was strong. That was like my motivation. And when I left editor-chief and created books like The Invaders and What If to get out of doing continuity and conferring. Right. In Jack's case, though, I think it was a stronger philosophical thing. I think it had some of those elements, but but again, I can't prove it. But sure. Everything that you see, makes, because, it would have been hard to have the Hulk. He could have found out in 5 minutes enough to do the Hulk and how to do it. He just didn't want to do it, and he was resisting it in every way possible. I mean, I tried to get him I had a plan in 75, 76 when he first came out. I had just taken over writing Fantastic Four again. This was like, the flagship title. Mm-hmm. And I offered a thing where I don't remember, we never just got around discussing the money aspects, but I got around to this thing. I said, I worked out with Stan so that Jack could plot the Fantastic Four, get credit for plotting it. So his name would come first because that was like part of the writing. And it would be Stan Lee, like plot or co-plot, whatever it would say, writer, and Roy Thomas after that. And I said, Jack, you can do this and your name will come first and you'll be back in the Fantastic Four. And Jack said, well, I'll do that, but I'll only do that if you plot out the stories panel by panel by panel in advance. And I figured it took me about 3 seconds to think, if I'm going to do that, I'm better off with Rich Buckler. Because Rich Buckler will give me some thought. Jack was determined, as I think Ditko became in a way, just not to give Marvel any thought. They both had this viewpoint, whether it's together, separately, or whatever. They wanted to hold back. And, as soon as you start thinking you're working for a company, but you're holding back, you're sabotaging the company and you're sabotaging yourself and you're sabotaging your future there. And I think it undercut Jack's value to the company and made him much less valuable than he could have been. He should have been much more valuable that second time around than he became. Wow.
Because it seems like you're offering the one thing that he really wanted was the credit and the ability to tell the stories his way and get the credit for it. And then you would have offered up the nuanced dialogue that was necessary to keep it popular and all that. And he turned it down. I mean, what could have been? Oh my God, that would have been freaking amazing.
Well, the thing too that's amazing,
we got our best,
Yeah, well, the thing that amazes me about what you just said is that he was like, well, then I want a panel by panel breakdown. Basically, it's like I can never see Kirby going, I mean, that's basically a full script.
Yeah, except for the dialogue.
Except for that, right.
Which he wouldn't have followed anyway.
Right. I don't think he would have followed it anyway.
Absolutely. I would have given him that stuff and it would have come back changed anyway. Maybe I should have tried it just to see what happened. But I was kind of offended by the idea, and I never pursued it anymore. But I've remained sad for the last almost 50 years that it never came to pass. Mm-hmm. So the only way I ever got to work with Jack on anything with the Fantastic Four was a couple of stories for the 1979 animated show and so forth. With the robot,
Well, did you write that What If story, or was that Stan?
No, that's really strange. I had this idea. What if the original Marvel bullpen had been the Fantastic Four? I was going to be a stupid issue of What If because I was just in a weird mood by that time in my life. So I worked out Jack, and I was, we'd both be editors, but I would have been sort of in charge of it. But I said, my idea was Stan's going to become Mr. Fantastic. Jack, of course, will be the Thing. I would be the Human Torch because I was the younger guy. And Flo Steinberg, who hadn't worked there since 1968, but I don't know if I got formal permission or I just knew she wouldn't mind. We made her the Invisible Girl because who else have we got? Unless it was Brie, maybe. So I gave it to Jack. I don't remember if he was supposed to write it or he just did. But anyway, I get the thing back. Well, he absolutely double-crossed me. He everything was right, except instead of making me the Human Torch, he made Saul Brodsky the Human Torch, the then production manager, who had, as I said, designed the FF logo and inked a couple of early issues. And I was just furious. This is my idea. Yeah. That takes me out of the story and substitutes somebody else. And then I thought about it. I thought, Jack's right. Saul Brodsky was there 5 years before I was, 4 years before I was. It makes more sense to have Saul Brodsky, who actually designed the logo, be the Human Torch than it did have Roy Thomas be it. So in that case, I overcame my ego and whatever. And where instead of asking for changes or insisting or doing more, I just accepted as it was. And I think it ended up being Jack's last real comic book on the Fantastic Four that he ever did, especially. Yeah. And I'm very pleased. It was kind of a silly story in certain ways. The only thing I had to change was Jack, he liked to twist Stan, the bitterness was there. And every time he mentioned Stan, he'd call him Stanley, because that's Stan's real name. And he knew Stan did not like to be called Stanley. And Stan, whether it was in purpose on the radio or in this case in writing, he loved to call him Stanley. So there's a whole mess of Stanleys. Stan looked it over. He wanted to make sure Jack wasn't going to pull too much on him, because he was the publisher, and he didn't make any changes to the book. He said, this is kind of silly. The S people, it's the Skrulls, and it's not a great story, but it's Jack doing the FF. But he said, you got to change one thing. Says, what that? He says, take out every Stanley and turn it into Stan. And I like the Stanley because that's the way Jack talked. But Stan says change it to Stan. Okay, but I mean, there was just that tension. The two guys were always they were just increasingly on bad wavelengths. They were just the opposite wavelength. They was getting further and further apart, just like him and Ditko.
Wow.
And of course, the Spider-Man thing is the top, the apex of it, I suppose.
Yeah.
The what?
The thing over who created Spider-Man with Jack.
Yeah.
And of course the answer is all of them. And that's one case, where if Stan's theory were right, that the person who had the original idea was the creator, Jack would have a certain, primacy, because it seems to be true that he brought in this strip to Stan called The Silver Spider that he and Joe had come up with, drawn by C.C. Beck, the Captain Marvel artist. And Jack didn't even write the strip. It was Jack Olick, evidently, the writer. So maybe Joe and Jack kind of had the idea or something, and he brings it in. Well, the funny thing is, it's this kid who has this ring and turns into an adult hero called the Silver Spider. 3 years earlier, guess what? A character had debuted, edited by Joe Simon, drawn by Jack Kirby at Archie Comics, called The Fly.
The Fly, yeah.
With a ring, he rubs the ring and he turns into an adult, but instead of a spider, he's a fly who fights a villain named Spider Spry. I mean, Jack was just trying to sell the same idea to Marvel.
Yeah.
And Stan didn't notice it because Stan would have seen that book and he'd have seen, is this nice art by Jack and so forth. But he wasn't even doing superheroes in 1959 when The Fly, so he wouldn't have paid any attention. So he didn't realize when Jack brings him the idea that he's bringing him the same idea they sold for The Fly.
Oh, wow.
And the person who evidently realized that, he said this, but Stan didn't remember any of this stuff. What he remembered started a little later. He just remembered, working with Jack and then with Steve on it, was that it's evidently Steve who noticed, this is The Fly. They already got that, which meant, of course, possible lawsuit if you did it. Sure. And one of the first things first thing I learned about Stan and Steve when I came to work there was that they weren't speaking to each other, which floored me, the idea that, But the second thing was that Jack had drawn several pages of the first Spider-Man story. There's no doubt about that. Whoever came up with the idea, whoever came up with the Spider-Man, did Stan say, I want a Spider-Man, and then they drag a Silver Spider? Did Jack bring it in? Who knows? Whatever it is, evidently several pages were drawn up. Saul had seen them too and talked to me about them. It was just two things. One was evidently the costume wasn't anything. It just looked like the Sandman, evidently, according to Ditko, the Sandman.
And he had a gun too.
He had a gun that shot out webs. It had nothing to do with what became, the ring and the whole bit.
Yeah, the Captain Marvel thing.
And he also evidently, for some reason, Stan, who admired Jack as a superhero artist beyond any other superhero artist, just sensed that Jack was, for once, for the only book to date in the Marvel universe, the burgeoning young Marvel universe, and for several years thereafter, that Jack was not the right artist, for it. He just couldn't quite get it. He couldn't get that, gangly teenage look, even though Jack drew gangly teenagers. Look at Johnny Storm in the early days. But he couldn't get that feeling. He kept making, since he was the hero, he kept making him a little too heroic and a little this and that. And after a few pages, now Jack in the interview says, we decided to give it to Steve Ditko. Now, if you believe that, I got several bridges I would like to sell you. Stan decided, obviously, because Jack wouldn't have given it up. Jack wouldn't have cared either that much, but it would have been Stan's decision because he's the editor. But Jack didn't. I don't think Jack cared. And that's why he could later think we decided to give it, because he's not lying about it. It's just he's reinterpreting it probably to make up for the fact that Stan took him off it. But Jack is, he's off it, and then they give it, and then Ditko says, hey, this is The Fly. So they start kind of almost from scratch, right? Except for the fact he's a teenager, they start from scratch. This absolutely fabulous costume, which Jack could never draw. The webbing in different directions. I don't think Jack ever drew the spider on Spider-Man's chest in a pencil in his entire life. If it's there, someone else added it, and so occasionally it got forgotten. But I mean, Jack, he didn't do a very good Spider-Man anyway, particularly. That was Ditko's character, and that just showed how right Stan's instinct was. But it doesn't lessen Jack as an artist. Jack is the greatest superhero artist of all time, and he's, while I feel Stan is the primary guy who created the Marvel Universe in one sense, you have to consider Jack in a certain sense the co-creator of the Marvel Universe too, because, without Jack, it would have been so different, or it wouldn't have existed at all. Who could he have got? Joe Maneely wouldn't have done it if he was alive, let alone being dead. Steve Ditko wouldn't have been able to do all that, let alone any of the other artists or anybody else he was likely to get.
Well, it's also the stuff that Jack added too. Like they might talk about, the Fantastic Four, and they go into this place, this other universe, whatever. But Jack had to create the visual language for that stuff, the negative zone. You name it. He created some of this machinery that would just be a background piece. It's almost like a Max or a E.C. Escher type thing with machinery, and it's like that's just a background piece. It wasn't discussed, but that's something that Jack brought to the table in all his drawings, which really helped establish the greatness.
Without Jack Kirby, we're all sitting around still talking about the Flash and Green Lantern, probably. If anything. I know Jack was so important that he's absolutely, and I think Stan kind of realized this. He sometimes he came close to saying it, and later on, after Jack left, he was never going to give him, he was never going to bring that up again. And that's why I think some of the stuff with Stan, not exactly erasing Jack, but lessening his part started like when he began to do the Simon and Schuster introductions to those reprint books in the early 70s.
Origins of Marvel Comics.
And then what, Son of Best of Marvel Comics and all those books. Stan wrote these things, and he was just kind of playing up himself and doubt what he'd say. Well, if I mention one artist, I got to mention all of them. Well, the real thing was Stan wanted to mention Stan, But at the same time, he mentioned Jack occasionally, but he just would mention him as the artist. If you'd got to stand a real conversation, you'd have soon got out how important he was. But remember when he's writing those Simon and Schuster things, which is the beginning of this sort of denigrating Jack's part a little bit, he's writing in front office an audience that never heard of Stan Lee or Jack Kirby. They didn't. 98% of those people never. All they cared about was they're getting a Spider-Man story, they're getting an FF story, they're getting a Hulk story. They didn't know who Stan Lee was, let alone Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko or John Romita or anybody. So Stan just figured, Well, okay, so he plays himself up and everything. We all do that a little bit. Maybe he did too much of it. If he had a good advisor, they could have told him to be more, more generous. Somebody could have given Jack the same advice, may I suggest? Neither one was as generous with the other as they could be. I just always maintained that Stan was much more generous about Jack than Jack ever was about Stan.
Well, and there's something that we're going real quick, and we're going to wrap it up. I know we have you on for a long time, Roy, and we really appreciate this. But this is something interesting that Ditko, let me share it. Here's talking about the Silver Spider, and it's the costumes. Yeah. This is illustrated by Steve Ditko. Yeah. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this.
Yeah.
And he has, here's Jack's, Simon and Kirby's Captain America. Then here's Jack's Spider-Man or Silver Spider, and you see the similarities. And as you had said, Jack would never design a costume like that. I think Ram had said it. And then here's Ditko's Spider-Man design. So it's just interesting. You see, and he's spelling out about the creators. Does two different costumes mean two different creators or creations? And it's very Ditko-esque.
Oh yeah.
Still only one creator and one creation. But it's like. But who created the published version, the published Spider-Man creation? I guess he's saying he did. So
yeah,
I always found that very really interesting, especially I know that
Steve was drawing that from memory, but it's probably pretty close to accurate. That sounds like what Saul Bradsky and Stan were saying. It was just like a nothing costume, but I mean, they never said anything more. Didn't remember it. Didn't Jim Shooter once say he saw some of those early Kirby pages? They were on the back of something else. I don't know. But I doubt if they were finished. They were probably rough pencils. I don't know.
What a show that would be.
Wouldn't it be great to have that?
Thomas and Shooter.
I'd love to see those.
Oh, my God. Well, we got another super chat here. Thank you so much, Neo Knight Rider. $5. Roy, whose idea was it to have Trimpe draw like Liefeld on Fantastic Four, LOL? And also, how do you and Steve get involved in Jack's Secret City for Topps Comics?
Well, as little as possible. I don't know much about whose idea it was exactly, but I know I was very unhappy when I saw Herb Trimpe drawing like Rob Liefeld, because Liefeld's style was way too grotesque for me, but it was very successful. I just hated to see Herb Trimpe drawing like that, but it was Herb. I think it was probably something that Herb wanted to do in a way, because somebody must have given him the idea that drawing that way would extend his life at Marvel. Because, Herb was never the greatest draftsmanship, or he wasn't a real action artist. He was a great storyteller. And if he started drawing more like Liefeld, he would attract more people, and it kept him working for another several years. I wrote most of those stories, and I just hated the look with the huge bodies and the tiny heads. I hated them on Liefeld. I hated them on Trimpe, because I thought both artists were better than that work. But if, Liefeld's popularity is its own, if you're a commercial art farm and it's commercially popular, I'd be an idiot to argue that he shouldn't be doing it. And Herb should be doing, I guess, whatever he needed to do. I just hated to see it. As for the Secret City stuff, that was an attempt by Topps Chewing Gum when they entered comics to get some Jack Kirby in there without having to have Jack actually do anything. So it was taking a bunch of his old drawings and concepts that hadn't even been part of the same concept. And I guess Jack wrote a kind of a little thing about the Secret City and everything. And they asked me to write it. And, basically the person who was supposed to, it was going to be one issue was by Ditko, one issue was Dick Ayers, and Don Heck did one, to get these three guys then together, and I was writing it. The guy who was supposed to draw the regular several issue series when the three got together, called the Secret City Saga. And by the way, I argued they should change the name and get it something like, what was I called, the Ninth Men or whatever. Give it a name of a group, not the Secret City. Nobody cares about a city. But, what do I know? And I'd only been editor-in-chief of the largest comic company in the world, so what did I know?
What did you know, right? And then, hello, Anna, that Star Wars girl is here. John Malin is dying inside.
The guy who was supposed to the guy who was supposed to draw that, and I was looking forward to it, was Gil Kane. who was supposed to write the story. But Gil withdrew at the last minute for whatever, reason. And I was sorry because we had done a lot of work together. And Ditko came in and did it. And while it was kind of nice to be working with, Ditko again, Ditko was a little like, he reminded me of Jack on that FF thing. He was you could tell from the plot. I would give him stuff and there'd be action in a fairly detailed plot. This is a several-page plot for a 20-page story. But he was determined not to give back anything that he could avoid giving back. If you wanted any kind of exact action or any kind of thing beyond just a fist fight, you'd better give him every single detail because he was determined not to give you. I think he and Jack might have conferred at some point, and decided, or either that or they were just of like minds. And so for that, no matter what I gave him, I felt I got, instead of getting more like you would have got from Jack or Steve at one time, or like I would have got from Rich Buckler or Jim Starlin or somebody like, or Herb Trippy or someone like that. Instead, you got less than you gave in. You got the absolute minimum that they could do. And as a result, I feel, that the series just, got off to a poor start, and I could never really breathe any life to it. And I feel that Steve kind of, again, he sabotaged himself in a way too, because that's not going to do my reputation any good, but it's not going to do his any good either to have done a lackluster job on a series that I think he did.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, age too,
I was a fan of Steve Ditko since Captain Atom, well before Spider-Man, so I hated to see that.
Yeah. It could be age too. I mean, Steve was probably, in his 60s, 70s maybe, when he was doing that.
You're letting him off the hook too easy.
I mean, let's be honest. His artwork. It was always like that. Entered into the mannequin stage. It was all surface detail, and they all looked like mannequins. There was never any, the lighting effects he used to use back in his monster days and his early Doctor Strange stuff were amazing. This stuff in the early 50s, you couldn't tell the difference between him and Joe Kubert. They were very, very similar stylistically. But by this point, again, this is what I call his mannequin phase, because everything looked like it was done with one of those wooden mannequins, that you get buy in the art shop,
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if Roy, we've had you on for, like I said, we go 45 minutes and we're already coming on an hour and a half. Thank you, Randy Howell, for this. And unless our guests have another question for Roy, everyone, for the uninitiative, Roy is a longtime editor of Alter Ego, the greatest of all Golden and Silver Age fanzines. Reserve your copy at your local comic shop. Number 185 is in stores on December 13th.
Well, thanks for that unsolicited plug, Randy, whoever you are. I wanted to thank, besides John Cimino, my manager and good friend who's here, also Pat Mason, retired professor of Spanish literature at the University of South Carolina, since I'm out in the middle of Podunkville out in the country and can't get a strong enough signal to do anything like this, she loaned me her house and so forth to do this in and so forth. So that's very good. And my wife, Dan, who's patiently sitting here hearing all these stories for the 87th time. So, and so forth. Maybe a few people heard it for the first, this is not going to answer all the questions. The people who don't want to be convinced are never going to be convinced, no matter if I had photographs of this stuff, they wouldn't believe it, let alone just my word. But, all you can do is tell what you remember. I don't know everything. They know less generally. So, and some of these questions, no matter what happens, they're never going to be definitively answered anymore, any more than we will ever know, who exactly did something 500 years ago. It's hard to tell, who did something. I mean, it's just something that's kind of lost to the ages. It's only important to a very small number of people as far as the names, but the characters and the world is important to a large number of people. And so I just think it's important we get it right for our own purposes. If the rest of the world doesn't care, well, we know we care.
Yeah.
100%. 100%.
Absolutely.
And I also want to thank you. And again, this was wonderful. We hope you'd come back on again. I don't know how you and Jim shoot, or if you guys are friends or anything like that, but I'd love to have, I think a fun show we could have is have us with you and say Jim on together. I think that would be a hoot and a half.
Like that, Jim and I, of course, have many bad things between us going back. At the same time, hey, he's the guy who said that I saved Marvel Comics by bringing Star Wars to it. So that's done a lot for my reputation. And so I thank him for that. No, Jim and I have done a couple of panels together at conventions. We have the things we're never going to agree on and so forth. And we discuss them, we don't discuss them. But I think we always kind of respect each other, because there's one thing I think we knew. We were the two editors-in-chief of the several very talented people that held the job, understand as publisher before he split for the West Coast about 1980 or so. We were the two editors-in-chief he had the most rapport with, the most respect for. In my case, I only stuck around about 2.5 years, was going to come back and then move to California to get away from it all. Jim stayed around for almost a decade and had more effect because of that, and because Stan was moving out of comics increasing in that stage. But we were still the two editors-in-chief that Stan felt the closest to and so forth. And I think we have, despite our many differences, we have a lot of things in common. It would be a hoot to be on with Jim. I think we get along, we probably wouldn't call each other too many names or anything.
Well, yeah, Graham and I had the privilege, right, Graham? We had dinner with Jim 3 nights in a row and hung out. We did a show, and Andy, you weren't there at nights with us though. Maybe one night you were there, but it was the North Carolina show that we did, the Fayetteville Comic-Con.
Oh yeah, I was there for that one. I was at a show where Jim was at Fayetteville, the year before, and had a very nice long conversation with him about the history of stuff and whatnot. I mean, it was fun talking to him.
We got snowed in at Grand Rapids one year, and then Jim actually got on his flight. But me, I couldn't make it out. I was stuck in Grand Rapids.
Yeah, because Jim and I, kind of started out together. I mean, I started out working for Mort Weisinger for a couple of weeks in 1965, and during the second of those 2 weeks, Mort Weisinger walks up to me and says he just got a script in from some teenage kid who's going to be his next great writer. He's telling me that he just hired me to also be a writer and editor.
Right.
And this is like no later than early July of 1965. And he had these scripts from Jim and so forth. I think he even mentioned his name, but the main thing was he was a young writer. And I don't think he knew quite how young Jim was. But the weird thing is, and Jim and I can discuss this where it goes, that although he talked like he's going to use these scripts starting tomorrow, he didn't actually approach Jim to actually buy anything from him until like January or February of 1966. So Jim sends these scripts in. Mort says this is going to be my next best writer, my next great writer. It takes him 6 months to actually buy a script from him. So we can discuss that too. So we sort of started out together. Our paths crossed in weird ways. I think we could have an interesting conversation about that.
Yeah, I think what a great show that would be. And Kellraiser, thank you for that $9.99 super chat. Great show, guys. Thank you, Roy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Roy, for sure. And then
thanks, Roy, for sharing your thoughts.
Yes, and I'd like to share one thing for people out there that may not know this. Roy, I'd love to have you come on again, because you, in 1958, with Gary Friedrich, horror film.
That's true.
Legooz.
Yes. Yeah.
Where you play the werewolf.
Lettering too. Yeah.
And
that's coloring. Yeah.
We've got to watch it. You did all the art for it. I mean, I don't want to blow it. It's on the Pop XP, guys, if you want to see it. But man, I would love to do a play-by-play on this. In actors or producers or directors, whatever capacity you had. Of course, with the great Gary Friedrich too.
Yeah. I played werewolf in that. I wrote the sort of outline script, as there's no sound. And I made myself a werewolf, which is kind of interesting, since then later one of my early monster creations was Werewolf by Night.
Yes, absolutely, 100%.
I had this thing out because of that, and John Sabino and a couple of people working with Nile added some kind of title cards to help it make sense for people that didn't know what was going on, and added some music in the background. It's just an awful movie, a 12.5 minute. There it is, me with this other guy That's not Gary, but that's me with the fake teeth and cotton to be hair, and it was just a ripoff of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, one of my favorite movies. And so filmed no editing. Every scene had to be filmed exactly the order because we didn't know how to edit it. It's just the most amateurish of amateur films.
It's fantastic.
That looks great.
Gary Friedrich, who co-created The Ghost Rider and and Son of Satan and things like this, is in it as sort of the Bud Abbott type of character.
He was great.
We had a lot lot of fun with it, and it's really awful.
It's not. It's a fantastic film, and I really like to. I'd love to have you on and have a commentary over because there is no sound. There's some nice music to it and all, but just you think it's 1958 and just being monster kids. I know Graham was a monster kid. I don't know if much of Andy was a monster kid like me too, though. But the makeup, because I want to know, like, where'd you get teeth from in 1958? How did all this stuff?
This is the same year I got in trouble with my English 4 teacher for going out at lunch and bringing back a copy of the first issue of Famous Monsters of Filmland and sticking it, not reading it, but just sticking it on my desk. And she saw it and just, here, I'm her best student. I've won the English 3 award. I won the English 4 award. And I've got this Famous Monsters with this green Frankenstein mask and a buxom girl at the cover. And she's wondering how I could read this trash. I said, well, I like these old movies.
Well, guys, you have any last parting questions or comments or anything for Gary, Andy, or Graham?
No, I just, I joined late, unfortunately, but I'm glad I got to spend the time and listen to some of these stories and stuff and ask the couple questions I had. So thank you for your time.
Yes. Thank you so much, Roy.
Thank you, Roy.
Well,
thank you.
And thank you, John, for setting it up. Thank you for your friends, your neighbors that actually were allowed you. We got to get you Starlink, which I saw the other night. Starlink satellite flew over me when I was out hunting in the woods, and it scared the crap out of me. I thought we were being invaded.
Oh, hey, Billy, for our pal and bro, Aaron Lopresti, I would just like to point out that Roy said one of his favorite movies is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Right?
Agreed.
All right, there it is.
Agreed, 100%.
We have a buddy that doesn't like Abbott. He just watched Abbott and Costello. He's a monster kid. He just watched Abbott and Costello for the first time.
How many of you saw it in 1948 when it was brand new on the screen?
No.
I'm the only one old enough to have done that.
Now, was that Vincent Price's first role as the Invisible Man?
No.
It wasn't? Okay.
No.
No, but he does do that voice at the end.
Yeah. Because Andy posted his roast for Betty Davis on the Dean Martin roast. Yeah. And he said he started off as the Invisible Man. That was his
Return of the Invisible Man, 1940 or
1939. Movies came out in 48. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and Mighty Joe Young. And they're still two of the movies I'd most like to watch on any rainy evening.
Yeah, right after Thanksgiving, we'll watch Mighty Joe Young. Comes on after Son of Kong.
Joe Young was great.
Yeah. Well, Roy, we got to talk monsters. We can have you guys on again. If you and John could hook this up, or we all chip in and just buy you Starlink, and you can do it from your house. But this truly was a real joy, a real privilege. Thank you so much, and everyone out there too. Thank you guys for joining us. Fraga Boom, good to see you, Fraga Boom. Smash that like button for us guys, and Mr. Thomas, again, as always, a true privilege. And we'll see you guys soon. All right.
Yep. We're happy to be on with such talented artists.
Thank you, brother.
Well,
thank you, John. Good to see you, buddy.
Thanks, chat.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again, everyone.